Okay, we have a joke ready. Oops, sorry. Okay, here you go.
Hmm. What is a vagina's favorite subject?
What?
Cliterature.
I'm sorry.
Cliterature.
I see. English or foreign? Well, yeah. Um, no, I go for it. So, last time I was here, we talked about abortion, and I purposely wanted to get to that first because I consider it more controversial. We're going to talk about contraception today, but first, I know you had a discussion last time. Any lingering questions or things people want to say about that? I mean, Tone was here guiding it. Thank you. Yeah. Sophie. Oh, how was the conference? I was at the Society for Neuroscience meeting in San Diego, and um, it it is slowly regaining. There were only 20,000 people there for that, whereas in the past it's been 30,000. And no, it was a good meeting. Learned some stuff. Met with a couple of editors. Don't tell anyone, but I spent one whole day at the zoo. Um, and yeah, so it was a good day. It was raining, which is, I mean, not supposed to rain in California. So, but thank you for asking. Other anything about the discussion, if you remember what to do with leftover embryos from IVF. Yes, sir. Have I ever what? What happened to Monday? No. What's it about? Okay, you're recommending it to everyone in class. Okay. And is it a comedy? Okay. Okay. All right. Well, we've just about thank you. Other questions, like okay. Well, let's talk about contraception then. And here are the sorts of things we're going to talk about. And there are the learning objectives. And let's get this out of the way. First of all, contraception and avoiding having babies has been an issue for people for about as long as we have any written records. So, in ancient times, in ancient Rome and Greece, which is, I mean, we know about this because it's so well documented. Um, if one had a child and didn't want it, it was perfectly acceptable to kill the baby, to take it, leave it out in the woods, out in the wild somewhere, and maybe animals would eat it, maybe it would starve to death, etc. But that was seen as a means of controlling when one has a child and when not. As you won't be surprised to learn, often if they were eager for a son and a daughter was born, it was much more likely the daughter would be that a daughter would be abandoned. Such, and in terms of trying to get another heir, of course, an heir before bottle feeding, keep in mind that once the baby was gone, the mother would start cycling again, since if she wasn't breastfeeding, and there'd be another chance. Um, in and of course, there are lots of stories about abandoned babies that, one way or the other, it works out and they do well, and sometimes it ends badly, like Oedipus, and sometimes they have a heroic life. In the Victorian times, once civilization and urban living came to London, for example, there was a whole industry of so-called baby farmers. So, what would happen, especially in affluent societies where often women, young girls who had no other way of making a living, would be brought in as servants, to upper class families. And if one of the males in the family uh, took an eye towards her, she was really not in much of a position to say no because she would lose her job and lose her livelihood. And then if she got pregnant, she would be fired. And so the baby farmer industry was one where a young woman who was unmarried and had a child needed to be rid of the child in order to have any chance of surviving. There were ads in the newspaper about these kindly old women who were looking for a child. And so through through a basically a dead drop of the newspaper, they would arrange to meet, always in a public place. The young woman would give the lady her baby, and the older lady would explain how, she always wanted a daughter or son, whatever it was. But of course, the child has to be fed, and so the young woman would pay the woman to take the baby and raise it as her own. And all that would be just fine, except at that point, of course, no young woman could actually pay enough to raise a child. And in fact, this was just a money making scheme. The baby farmer would then get rid of the baby, rarely murdering it, more often letting it starve to death, and then be ready to exploit another woman. And nobody noticed, right? This wouldn't get noticed until investigative reporters were noticing that the police talked about how many dead babies were found in the Thames River, right? What's behind that? And then once somebody looked, then baby farming became outlawed. Um, of course, none of that's contraception, that's infanticide. So interest in contraception has also been great, and there are all sorts of home remedies out there that have been around for years, and none of them work. None of them are effective at being able to have sex and not have the risk of getting pregnant. The exception would come in the 1700s when people got the idea of whether they could have a membrane that was thin enough to slip over the penis to contain the semen and yet still be pleasurable. And in the early days, they were made out of things like guts from lambs and things like that, and they were expected to be reusable, and they were probably relatively effective. Um, when rubber was developed in the 1890s, then rubber condoms were used. But by 1930, this newly discovered stuff, latex, which could be even thinner than rubber and was also still impermeable, that's when condoms became much more common. Another way to prevent pregnancy is to prevent the sperm not from getting out of the penis into the vagina, but prevent sperm from getting to through the cervix. And so a diaphragm, we'll talk about modern versions of them in a bit. Today, they're of course made out of latex-like material. But Casanova, I forget whether it's Casanova or Don Juan, one of them writes in his memoir about how he always carried around with him a bit of a lemon peel, and he would have his mistress slip the lemon peel into her vagina and against the opening of the cervix, and that way they could have sex and she wouldn't be likely to get pregnant. But synthetic ones were available by the 1880s. As you all know, a watershed event was 1960 when the birth control pill became available in the United States for the first time, and that changed everything. We've run into the ramifications of that repeatedly. So that by 1965, there were nearly 7 million women that were on the pill, and in most states, it was illegal for unmarried women to buy it. So doctors would only prescribe the pill for you if they knew you were married. And the idea being, well, it's okay to have sex in a marriage. And if you don't want to have another baby in a marriage, that's family planning, that's acceptable. But if you're a single woman, why would you want a contraceptive pill? You're not going to have sex. Yeah.
Well, diaphragm or spermicide.
In some cultures, what?
People used crocodile feces as like a spermicide or
Oh,
diaphragm. Do you know anything about that?
I don't, but I'll bet you it doesn't. I'll bet you it doesn't work, except except to the extent that it might make both individuals less interested in having sex in the first place. But I don't know. And from the beginning, it's been a controversial question. So, as you might get from talking about the early restrictions on the pill, it's pretty hard not to see this as a situation where, in a patriarchy, I hope it's okay to use that word, that men would try to control women's reproductive behavior, so that it was illegal for women to try to have sex and not get pregnant. So, at for a long time, it was not only illegal to engage in contraception, it was also illegal to tell anyone how to do it. So, uh, lots of nurses and physicians went to jail, were sent to jail because they had explained to women things like the rhythm method or talked about condoms and things like that. Everything went especially badly by 1873, the so-called Comstock laws, which, by the way, some politicians are talking about reviving and coming out with again. The Comstock laws made it illegal to use the U.S. mail to disseminate information about how to avoid contraception. And lots of people were prosecuted for that and spent time in jail for it. One of them being Margaret Sanger, a interesting person, sort of one of my heroines, who in her memoirs talks about how she came to be invested in teaching women about contraception. She was a public nurse in the tenements and immigrant communities in New York City, and talked about counseling a young woman who had just survived a childbirth and telling her that she would not survive another pregnancy. She needed to stop getting pregnant. And the woman told her, "But my husband works hard all day, and when he comes home, how can I not comfort him?" And sure enough, she got pregnant again, and sure enough, she died before it. And so that was sort of a sparking event for her, that and similar things, where she started going in a public campaign to teach women about contraception, and went to, jail for at least once. I won't remember all the interesting things about it. She was definitely an advocate of what was then called the free love movement, which meant that she felt like people should have sex with people they wanted to have sex with, not necessarily who they were married to. I think she had an affair with H.G. Wells, and she was just she was definitely an agitator, and she paid a price herself. But I think she's been vindicated. And yeah, so she started the first birth control clinic in New York City in 1916. If we look at the number of pregnancies that happen, of all pregnancies, about half of them are not intended, which doesn't mean that they're unwelcome, but it means that they were not intentional. And then if you look at all those unintended pregnancies these days, about a third of them are terminated from abortion, and 2/3 of them that go through. And there's no way really to gauge the impact of this unwanted pregnancies, right? I mean, I mean, who knows what the consequences are for a child to be born in a family where they're not wanted, right? And I'm sure many times they're not wanted at the beginning, and they have loving and supportive families, but who knows how many times the child is born and kind of gets, second best treatment. If we look at, wrong way, the outcomes of those pregnancies, there we are. These are somewhat out of date, but they're probably not too different, at least back when Roe v. Wade was still in effect. If we look at all the pregnancies, almost half were wanted. About a fifth were not. About a fifth were lost through abortion. And as I keep reminding you, Spontaneous abortions are totally common among people who are trying to have children. So that's happens, so-called miscarriages. And in the United States, most women who don't want to have a child do use some sort of contraception. So here's how it breaks down. These days, about a quarter of the women of childbearing age use the pill. About 1 out of 5 have at one point or another had themselves sterilized. Typically, women who have already had as many children as they want and will then have their tubes tied. We'll talk some more about that later. Condoms are still highly popular and, as we'll see, are effective when used properly. They're not always used properly. What's the advantage of condoms and the reason they're always with us is they can be used spontaneously, right? There doesn't need to be much planning as long as condoms are available. And about a tenth of women of childbearing age use IUDs for contraception, intrauterine devices, about which more later. Male sterilization, that means vasectomies. Some people rely on coitus interruptus or withdrawing, where the man tries to gauge when he's about to ejaculate, and at that point withdraws and lets the ejaculate go somewhere other than in the vagina. It's not a very effective or reliable method. The implant, we'll talk about that, and other hormonal methods are basically other variations on the pill. And so you put all those together, and it's closer to maybe a third of women are taking one form or another of the pill to keep from conceiving, specifically to keep from ovulating. And then the folks that use natural family planning, the so-called rhythm method, there. So among college students, so of those students who have vaginal intercourse, right? So we're talking about heterosexual couples. The male condom is far and away the most often used, but a close second is a contraceptive pill that the woman is taking. Many rely on withdrawal, so you know what that means is it was a somewhat spontaneous encounter where a condom wasn't arranged ahead of time, the pill wasn't used ahead of time, and of course, many of those encounters, I shouldn't say it that way, some of those encounters result in pregnancy because it's not effective. It's pretty rare for college-age women to have implants. We'll talk about them in a moment. Usually, more often, they're used or useful to women who are in a stable relationship, have been married quite a while, for example, and are trying to keep track of number of children. Emergency contraception, also known as PlanB. We'll talk about how these work in a bit, but these are now available over the counter, which was an incredible struggle to make that possible, where if a woman has had unprotected sex, and if in the next few days she takes the PlanB regimen, she decreases her chance of getting pregnant. And I want to emphasize this. And PlanB works by preventing ovulation. It does not work by causing abortion, more later. And some women just try to keep track of where they are in their period. We'll talk about the patch and injection and rings, all of which are also forms of the birth control pill. And it's pretty rare for college-age women to have had tubal ligation or to prevent pregnancy. Of all these methods, some of them are quite effective. So to understand this table, if you're using no method at all, right? So the failure rate, we're keeping track here, with no method at all, the failure rate is about 85%. That doesn't mean that in each sexual encounter, there's an 85% chance the woman will get pregnant. It means that those women who are not using any other method and who are sexually active are likely to get pregnant eventually. Of the physical methods, condoms, well, let's say that's there. The failure rate of condoms, if they're used properly, it's quite low, which is to say they're effective. They do work. And we'll talk about how you can use them properly and how you can use them improperly. And what's important about this table is it also talks to you about not only how effective it is when it's done perfectly, but what happens when it's done used in real life where things are not perfect. And so there's a pretty good failure rate of condoms for that reason. Female condoms are also very effective. We'll talk about what that is in a moment. But again, they're harder to use, and therefore, with typical use, they don't necessarily work. Same with the diaphragm and the cervical cap, which is another version of the diaphragm. IUDs are very effective at preventing pregnancy. So they're very effective, very reliable, and as we'll see, safe. The disadvantage of IUDs is that they have to be put in place by a physician and have to be removed by a physician, but they are incredibly effective at preventing contraception, as is the pill. So we'll get there in a moment. So here's a table that someone tried to put together about from the least effective to the most effective. And of course, sterilization is the most effective. But after that, implants and IUDs. The implant is a little more effective than the pill, even though the endocrinological basis is exactly the same. But the thing about having an implant is you don't have to remember to take the pill every day, for example. And these are very effective. Notice that even though it's further down the line, the failure rate is quite low and compared to physical methods. Questions about any of that so far? So let's talk about the physical methods first. Condoms. The advantage of the condoms is that they're cheap and they're readily accessible. And when used properly, they're pretty reliable. The additional thing about condoms is not only do they prevent conception, but they also act as a barrier to sexually transmitted infections. And that's not true of any of the other methods we're going to talk about. There are very few side effects, aside from those rare occasions where people happen to be allergic to latex, but then there are alternatives available for that. So there are very few side effects. The other thing that's very important about them is probably responsible for the fact that they have such a high success rate or such a low failure rate is that if the condom's there, both parties know it. And so it can't be a matter of one party saying, oh, I'm on the pill when they're not, or the other party saying, I've been vasectomized when they're not, et cetera. And if it's being used in a stable couple who eventually want to have children, it's immediately reversible. As soon as they decide they want to try to get pregnant, all they have to do is stop putting the condom on, and they're ready to go. It also, it's not interfering with the woman's ovulation, so there's no, as sometimes happens with the pill, it might be a few months before ovulation resumes after going off the pill, but the condom's reversible immediately. There are lots of disadvantages of condoms. One of them is that you have to stop what you're doing long enough to put it on properly, right? And so people may find that that's intrusive, that it sort of kills the mood. Of course, with a little bit of thought and creativity, one can make applying the condom part of the foreplay and make it an exciting part of the whole encounter. There's no reason why it has to be, oh, well, stop, let's do this, which, has its disadvantages. And which brings us to the male involved has to feel comfortable enough about putting on the condom that they maintain their erection. You can have a situation where if he's sufficiently self-conscious or worried about putting the condom on, then the erection starts to go, and nothing reduces an erection faster than worrying about whether you're going to have an erection, right? So it can be a positive feedback loop there. The other thing is that after ejaculation, because the penis is going to lose size quite right away, it's not a good idea to leave the penis, even if it's inside the condom, in place very long, because inevitably the penis shrinks, the condom squeezes out the semen, and now it may have access to the opening of the vagina and potentially to the oviduct. And the other thing that almost no one ever talks about with condoms, which is probably the biggest downside of condoms, is that inevitably they reduce sensation for both partners. So, and there's just no way of getting around that. The You remember we talked earlier about the Krauss end bulbs, these incredibly sensitive touch receptors that are found exclusively in genitalia. They were designed to respond most to skin versus skin and skin versus interior of the vagina. And so the condom inevitably reduces that somewhat. Of course, this might not be a bug. In some cases, this might be a feature, because especially for men who are worried about premature ejaculation, if they're worried about staying hard long enough to please their partner, putting the condom on means there'll be less stimulation, and therefore he's not likely to ejaculate as soon as he might otherwise. Um, and yeah, and so there are prizes out there. This was before they got divorced, for trying to come up with a better condom. But as far as I know, nothing's been found. Latex is about as thin as you can get and still be a reliable barrier. Questions about all of that? They come in a large variety, but really they all work the same way. Some condoms are, ribbed, because with the hope that that would provide better sensation for both parties. And indeed, some people feel that they are effective, but for the most part, you have to wonder if that's a placebo effect. But any of them will do. Uh, Now you can get them in different sizes, which I mean is just astonishing to me. It used to be that was a practical joke you'd play on a young man. Because you had to go to the drugstore and you had to ask for condoms. You'd say, I want to buy some condoms. The practical joke was, when you go there, be sure to tell them you want the extra large size, right? The joke being there was no size. They were all the same size, because that size fits every penis that's out there. But it was to be the joke on the young man. Well, marketing has caught up with the joke. So now you can get them in various sizes. And I don't see a reason not to try to match the size with whatever size your penis is. Although, really, did you take out a tape measure? But you don't need to worry about any of that. Any condom, any size, it'll work just fine. To use a condom properly, first of all, you have to learn how to unroll the condom. Some condoms come with lubricant and some don't. And it's really just a personal preference for the couple. And so the important thing is to unroll the condom while the penis is still erect. And so again, the gentleman involved the man involved has to be comfortable putting that on. And if you can make it something playful and sexy, that's going to help everybody involved. And then after and an important thing is to pinch the end of the condom so that there's a little bit of volume inside there, so that once the man ejaculates, there's plenty of room for the ejaculate inside the condom itself. The folded over tip of the condom, neither party's going to notice it. They're not going to be able to feel it there. So there's no reason not to do that. And it's not so much worried that if you don't do that, that the condom will burst. They're very strong, very effective. It is that if there's not room for the ejaculate in there, it's more likely to work its way along the shaft of the penis, especially after erection starts to go down, and could lead to trouble. So it's important that when the man has ejaculated, that he put his thumb and forefinger firmly around the base of the condom as he withdraws, to keep it onto the penis until he's fully out of the vagina, and then throw the condom away. Don't put it in toilets. It's only going to lead to trouble for somebody. Just throw them away. Oh, and it's important that with latex condoms, which far and away the most important, not to use any petroleum-based lubricants, rather water-based or silicone-based lubricants only. Questions about any of that? And if you think you might want to use a condom someday and you're concerned about it, by all means, um, it's a great exercise to just open a condom and roll it onto a banana, right? And I should say a banana that's still in its peel, because then afterwards you can peel the banana, you can still make use of it. Um, but and then yeah, and the only tricky part is understanding once you get the condom out which way it rolls to unroll. But that's so that's worth figuring out ahead of time. Okay. And it's interesting. Here's a figure that is left out, I think, of the current edition of the textbook. But apparently, people were trying to come up with a way of putting a condom on easier. And I think it's another one of those things that hasn't really made much of an impact. Um, like I said, they've been around a long time. It used to be when they were more or less handmade, stitched out of lamb's intestine, for example, things like that, that it might be a good idea to check to make sure that they were still airtight. Um, and um, and this was in an era when the things would be washed with soap and water and reused. You don't have to do that anymore. The reliability of the manufacturer is very high. So this idea, which is still out there, I guess, that you need to inflate it to make sure it's not built to leak, don't bother. Also, the question of, do condoms get old? And of course, there are expiration dates, and it's not a bad idea to check that. And anything you do that will expose the condom in its foil wrapper to lots of mechanical forces is going to be more likely to cause a problem, either in the integrity of the latex or a loss of lubricant if it happens to be lubricated, things like that. Questions about that? And every college campus student health center has condoms available for free. Somebody does that. That's still true here, right? Okay, good. Because, pardon? Also, residential assistants have them? What a great idea. Okay, yeah. There's a big jar of condoms. Yeah, good idea. Yeah, yeah. Don't be shy. Grab one, check it out, even if you have no intent to use one soon, or even if you have no intent to use one ever. It's a pretty clever human device for a pretty basic problem. Yeah.
Say contraceptive
Mhm.
and birth control at the Gender and Sexuality Campus Center as well as the Women's Center, and they're both located in student services.
So there's several places on campus to get them: the Women's Center and the Gender Sexuality. Oh, okay. They're available, and they're inexpensive. You can also just buy them, and now you don't have to ask a pharmacist for them. They're just out there on the shelves. Yeah.
And other things, a lot of vending machines on campus in a lot of buildings.
Cool. Lots of places on campus to get condoms, and PlanB, about which more soon. As long as we're on physical, as long as we're on physical methods, then there's female condoms. These are not used very often, though they are at least as effective as other condoms. There's an outer ring that's attached to the condom, and you maybe can't tell that here, but these hoops are totally flexible, and so they can be squeezed and pushed into the vagina. And and as with condoms, they can be used with silicone or water-based lubricants, not petroleum-based lubricants. Diaphragms. So diaphragms are devices that are intended to go into the vagina and over the opening of the cervix to provide a physical barrier to keep the sperm from getting into the uterus and from there up to the oviduct where they could cause a pregnancy. One of the advantages is that they're relatively less invasive or interrupt intrusive because the woman can put it in hours before she intends to have sex, for example, and her partner may not even be aware that it's there. It has few or no side effects, again, with the exception of rare people who are allergic to latex, but there are alternatives available there. It's relatively cheap, and it also has the advantage of, while it doesn't protect against all sexually transmitted infections, and in fact, let me say that differently, it's not a protection from sexually transmitted infections, but it turns out that it does slightly reduce the chance of getting cervical cancer from human papillomavirus infections. These days, with an incredibly effective immunization against the human papillomavirus, that's even less of an issue than it ever was. The disadvantages are that you can't just buy one off the shelf. They have to be fitted. They do have to be fitted with a professional. And so OBGYNs, Planned Parenthood clinics, places like that can do that, but it's not, it's somewhat expensive, but not free and not really easy. The failure rate's pretty high compared to the condom, and that's not to do with because they're harder to use. It's just this barrier, right? I mean, think about it. A condom, if used properly, all the semen is inside the condom. Never has a chance to get into the vagina, much less into the uterus. But with a diaphragm, you know that semen is going to be in the vagina, and depending on how the cap is removed, the diaphragm removed, and things like that, it might be possible that a sperm would get through there. And it has less STI protection than condom. Again, for the same reason. The semen that includes any STI carrying microbes is going to be in the vagina, and that gives it access to the woman's body. And so it doesn't have that advantage. Here's a diagram of what it looks like. It's often used with some sort of gel, like including maybe a spermicide. And the idea is you fold it so that it will slip easily into the vagina and then position it so that it's over the cervix. Sometimes it's used with a spermicide in the vagina as well. Although in general, spermicides are not terribly effective, but still might be better than nothing. There are variations, including some where there's a valve that fits over the cervix, and so menstrual fluid can come out, and it can be left in place a long time after sex, again to prevent the possibility of any sperm getting into the cervix after you removed it. And it's simple to maintain. You just wash it with soap and water and reuse. And it is an instance where it seems to be one size fits all. In general, there are lots of different kinds of spermicides. They tend to be foams or maybe capsules or maybe sponge-like devices. And if there was a spermicide that was incredibly effective, that would have changed the world. And I think you can therefore safely assume that there's no substance out there that will work well. That works well enough to be relied on. There are several different organic compounds that serve as spermicides, but so there's several choices. For some people, some spermicides may cause a burning or uncomfortable sensation, and so if you're going to rely on that as a method, you might want to try other formulations to see if that's better. And questions about cervical caps, diaphragms. Well, let's go away from physical barriers to talking about IUDs. So IUDs got something of a bad rap because there was one particular model that was widely used that was not safe, but that controversy, maybe long enough ago now that you've never even heard of it, seems to have faded. And what intrauterine devices do is they basically irritate the opening of the cervix to induce inflammation, a low-grade inflammation in the area. When things are working well, it's not enough inflammation to cause any discomfort to the woman, although some women with an IUD report having some sensation of discomfort even after it's put in or taken out. But the idea is that with that inflammation there, the opening of the cervix is just too small for sperm to make their way there. And so the sperm don't get upstream, and therefore, even though the woman's still ovulating, they are not going to encounter an egg and ever, because the IUD device, once put in, typically women will leave it in place for years. So it's not something that you put in and take out. Rather, you go to an OBGYN or birth control clinic, and they put it in with using a speculum and things like that. And it can't be removed except with special devices. And so again, taking it out requires a visitation. So here's the sort of thing that we're talking about, where it comes in a collapsed form, so that with the use of the speculum, the professional can insert the device into the cervix, and there, once it's inside the uterus, it expands so that now it won't be able to come back out easily. And typically there is a strand of nylon that is attached to the base of it, which, when things work well, neither the woman nor her partner will be aware of it there. And then that can be used to remove the IUD, to send the device up, recollapse the IUD, and bring it out. Typically, there is some discomfort involved in the implanting or removing of an IUD, and different women report different degrees of discomfort. And of course, there are some medicines that can help with that. When things are working well, though, it's only discomfort for a few days before or after the procedure, whatever it is. The great advantage of IUDs, especially for women who are in a stable relationship and know they don't want to have a baby yet, it offers no protection from STIs. But again, if you're in a stable relationship, you're not worried about sexually transmitted infections, and it means that there's nothing has to interrupt the flow of a sexual encounter, and neither side has to think about or remember or do anything. It's just there. And then the other thing that's advantageous for them is once they decide they do want to have children, after the IUD is removed, the woman has been ovulating just fine, so nothing's interfered with her ovulatory cycle. And then once it's removed, they, that will only be a month or so that the inflammation will be gone, and the chance of pregnancy will be there. And there's no evidence that using an IUD reduces the chance of pregnancy later, except that, of course, the older women get, the more difficulty they might have getting pregnant. And so if you factor out age, then there's no evidence that IUDs impair future fertility. Pardon? Oh, some do. Yeah. Well, and that may be true. I don't know. I know that some IUDs do have some hormone infusion in it, but the way they work is the same. And not to confuse with implants that we'll talk about in a moment of this birth control pill. Yeah. Okay. I don't know. I didn't know that. Here are the advantages. It's even more effective than the pill in real life, because nobody has to remember to take the pill every day or take the pill at the same time of day and stuff like that. Relatively few side effects, except when it's put in or taken out. It's non-intrusive, totally reversible. it is not cheap. So it, I'll bet those numbers for the fees are, first of all, those numbers for the price, I'm sure the price has gone up, and the fees to implant are taken out are I'm sure higher than that. No protections against STIs, and apparently there's a very slightly higher risk of ectopic pregnancy. So if a woman is using an IUD and her period is at all late, it's probably not a bad idea to find out if she's pregnant, and with a test for HCG, and then consult with the doctor about keeping an eye on that. Oh, but it also sometimes happens that pregnancies happen with the IUD in place. Likewise, there are some cases where women are taking the pill every day and they're relying on that in contraception, but every once in a while an ovulation takes place anyway, and a pregnancy can result. And so at that point, if they're using an IUD and they end up being pregnant and it looks like it's in the uterus and coming along, then they can make a decision about whether to have an abortion or not. I think the advice is, in that case, to leave the IUD alone, right, until delivery comes. Questions about that? And here you are. You're right. Mirena has hormone in it. So, and I guess the point of Mirena is to actually decrease ovulation, decrease the growth of the endometrial lining, etc. But they are very effective. Paragard, as you say, because there's no relying on hormones that will eventually run out. It can last much longer, and the failure rate is still less than 1 in 100. And that's the failure rate of, this is what the person that's involved in opposite sex copulation, they're relying on it for contraception, and 99% of the time it works. They don't get pregnant during that time. Okay, other questions about IUDs, just in case I do happen to know the answer. It can happen. All right, well, let's have a quick. So here are the things we're going to be learning about. And the birth control pill works by preventing ovulation. And the mechanism, the easiest way to describe it is it takes advantage of the mechanism of negative feedback that you learned about, the most basic mechanism we know in endocrinology, where it means that as long as there are gonadal steroids in the system, the brain will interpret that to mean that that everything's fine, and therefore will not release gonadotropins. And without the gonadotropins, the ovaries follicles can't ripen. Without luteinizing hormone, the ovary won't ovulate. And if there's no ovulation, there can't be any pregnancy. They tend to be constant dose. We'll see in a moment that sometimes people that are out there in the market, pills that are not the same dose every day, but they tend to be the exception, not the rule. So we'll talk about that here. And all of them work by keeping the hypothalamus from releasing GnRH. And so if the hypothalamus doesn't release I think I have a picture here. If the hypothalamus doesn't release GnRH, then the anterior pituitary won't release gonadotropins. And without the gonadotropins, ovulation won't take place. So typically the early ones were using estrogens. So the estrogens would feed back and inhibit the red parts of the circle there and keep ovulation from taking place. So it's, on one hand, simplicity itself, though it took quite a while and a lot of money, almost all of it, all of it privately raised, because no government was going to pay for that research, to find a relatively cheap source of estrogenic-like compounds and to do the testing, et cetera. In the first place, the very first pill, the estrogens were, as I recall, derived from yams. So they found a a estrogenic-like compound in yams that could be grown and processed to create the estrogen. So just a reminder of the ovulatory cycle, where FSH acts on the ovary part to cause follicles to develop. And then when there's a peak of FSH and LH at then estradiol is high, then ovulation takes place. The corpus luteum forms in the follicle that's left behind. It starts producing progesterone. And if the corpus luteum eventually it stops producing progesterone and the cycle will start over again. And the only thing that can stop that cycle from happening again, the spontaneous ovulation, is if there's a source, say, of HCG that promotes the corpus luteum to stick around longer, produce progesterone longer, long enough for an embryo to start controlling the process. And some mini pills, most of them, I would say, are one where you take the pill every day and then don't take the pill for a week. Menses happens, right? Because in the absence of estrogen and progesterone maintaining the endometrial lining, it'll be sloughed off. And then start taking the pill again to prevent the next round of ovulation from taking place as well. In some cases, there will be 7 pills that are placebo, sugar pills basically. And the idea is, as long as you look at the pack and figure out which day it is, you know whether you took it or not. And that way you don't have to keep track, makes things easier. There are lots of advantages of the birth control pill. They're very reliable as long as you remember to take the pills every day, and it's pretty easy for most people to find some way to ritualize that so that it takes place. It's very convenient, non-intrusive. It's easily reversible. Once a woman has been on the pill for a while, if she stops taking it, it may take a cycle or two, but eventually ovulation will get going again on its own. For many women, they feel like when they're on the pill, they have fewer menstrual symptoms. So fewer symptoms of menses and fewer discomforts around that. It reduces the risk of several disorders for reasons no one quite understands. It seems to reduce the risk of ovarian cancer, but its role in breast cancer is somewhat more controversial. It's also less likely to end up in ectopic pregnancy for the simple reason if there's no egg released, there can't be a pregnancy anywhere, ectopic or otherwise. It has no protection from STIs. You have to remember to take them everywhere, every day. And there's no way for the male partner to know whether, in fact, the female partner has been taking it, faithfully and carefully every day. And we all know stories. I know of some where in this case, the husband was assured that his wife was on the pill, but because he didn't want to get pregnant, and she did, and lo and behold, she wasn't taking the pill after all. And there's no way for the male partner to know if that's taking place. They do have side effects. Anytime you're taking any medication, there are always side effects. And talk about that here. And the most common reported complaints of people that are taking the pill are nausea, breast pain, increase in breast size, irregular bleeding, decreased lubrication, etc. But in studies that use placebo-controlled, the only ones that remained were these: breast pain and emotional lability. So it's not clear how many of these symptoms are in fact placebo effects or how many are genuine. And of course, as always with these sorts of descriptions, women are going to differ, right? Different women are just because in one study, the average woman showed no increased likelihood reporting irregular bleeding. Of course, that doesn't mean that within that population, there weren't some women where in fact that was an effect of the pill. So you have to take all this with a grain of salt. And I've already told you, you may be wondering, how is it anyone ever did a study where it was double-blind, placebo-controlled, and some women were getting the pill and some weren't, but everyone was being told that they were, and so yeah, a clinic for poor people. That's where that study got approved, and it would never get approved again. And so it's one of those things where we're not going to know how many of these effects are genuinely in response to the pill and how many are not. On the third hand, if the woman's taking the pill and says, I now feel like I have, a lot more irregular bleeding, I have a lot less decreased lubrication, even if it's a placebo effect, it's still real, right? And so for her, that might be a disadvantage. In some cases, there are things one can do about it. Certainly, plenty of things one can do about reduced lubrication. But for each woman, she'd have to make a choice for herself. It is, for some women, there's a response to hypertension, worry of blood clots, stroke. For women with liver disease, there can be increased risk um, of exacerbating that. Most of these rare but serious side effects are increased in women who also smoke. So if they also smoke cigarettes, then all these possibilities are more often. And I think these days, the consensus is there is a slight increase in the risk for breast cancer, but it's amazing how controversial that remains and not easy to track down.
One of the interesting things about birth control is that it doesn't work if you smoke nicotine, right? Like it doesn't work right. It doesn't even have to be cigarettes. Like it can be like vaping, it can be Zins, but basically if you have nicotine in your system, it disrupts natural hormones. So it can make you have 2 periods if you're on birth control.
Okay, so good point. I mean, when I'm saying smoking, that's the most common way, especially for women, to get their nicotine. But I have no reason to think that it's cigarettes versus any other form of nicotine. Um, and um, and of course, using nicotine if you're not on the birth control also reduces your health. Right? Not a good idea. Um, One of the things that's interesting about the pill is, in fact, well, I'll explain to you in a moment. Why do women stop taking it for 7 days? They haven't ovulated, right? The endometrial lining of the uterus has grown somewhat. In some women, it doesn't get as thick as it does when they're in the natural period, which is why they have fewer symptoms of menstrual, et cetera. And in fact, in some cases, people just keep taking the pill every day. So in this case, the recommendation is take it every 3 months and then stop taking it for a week to, I suppose, allow the endometrial lining to be shed and start anew, and then take it again. The story of why they're almost always done that way. Oops, where's my slide on that? Well, we'll go ahead here. So why is there typically done such that there'll be a menstrual cycle, a menstruation? And it really has to do with the early days of the pill being rolled out, when a particular physician, Dr. John Rock, was a ardent Roman Catholic, and he wanted to convince the Vatican that this was a natural method and not an unnatural method. And so he advocated for having the regimen be one where there'd be a period every 4 weeks, just like normally, in the hope that the Vatican would then say, oh, so it's okay for women to use this. But he was wrong, and the Vatican did not approve it. And so the Roman Catholic Church doctrine to this very day is that use of contraceptive pill is a sin and should not be done. Although the majority of American Catholics, women, use the pill or use some sort of contraception, including the pill. And so that's why it happened. You can read about it more here. And there's several different ways to take the pill. The Nuva ring is one that's been infused with some sort of gonadal steroid or other that will last for 3 weeks to prevent gonadotropin release. Likewise, patches that go on the skin where there's a barrier or an interface between the patch and the skin to slowly allow the estrogen in to work for a week at a time. Much more effective are implants like Norplant that is put in, and basically it's going to slowly release the same active ingredient for years at a time. It's expensive, has to be done by a physician, but otherwise it's incredibly effective. And sometimes it's done as an injection of a depot rather than implant. And I think yeah. They're vulnerable. Calculating. Well, so one of the things that the pill has done is to reduce the number of ovulatory cycles that women who are taking it will have in a lifetime. As the slide says here, most women would have very few ovulatory cycles in a lifetime before the modern era, because once they were cycling, once they became of reproductive age, most of their life was spent being pregnant or lactating or both, and the lactation postponed cycles. Today, women who are cycling spontaneously will have hundreds of ovulatory cycles, hundreds of ovulations take place, and that is unusual or not how we evolved. The morning after pill, I always want to talk about that, is basically a very high dose of gonadal steroid. Before it was available commercially, like at health clinics, typically in universities, like when I was going to school in 1972 to 1976, the University Health Service would make that available, what they called a morning after pill. And it was basically 2 or 3 birth control pills taken at once. So the way they work, and you know enough about endocrinology now to know, is it is going to act on the brain to reduce GnRH release, which means it's going to reduce the chance of the anterior hypothalamus releasing gonadotropins, which means it's going to reduce the possibility of ovulation. For it to work, it has to be taken within 72 hours of sex. If it's been more than 3 days since the sex took place, it's very unlikely to work. And it is typically they take one pill and then a second pill 12 hours later, known as PlanB, Prevent, et cetera. And it's pretty effective. It reduces the chance of pregnancy, by a lot. Much better than doing nothing. And if it's taken within 24 hours of having sex, it's highly effective. The way it works is this. The reason it has to be taken right away is because the only way it can work is if it prevents ovulation. And if you look here, we've seen this before, these are the days in which gathering sperm will increase the chance of pregnancy, the peak being on the very day of ovulation. And so if you had sex on this day, right, you aren't going to get pregnant anyway. If you have the sex the day after ovulation, you aren't going to get pregnant because the sperm may get to the egg, it may fertilize the egg, but the egg won't have developed enough to implant in in the endometrial lining. In other words, the sperm won't get there in time to fertilize it in the oviduct, which it has to do for a successful pregnancy. So if you had sex with someone this day, you've gathered the sperm, they're in there, you're not going to get rid of them. But if you take PlanB the next day and stop ovulation, then you have a chance. And why does it work within 72 hours? Because you might have gathered the sperm this day, and if you take it 3 days later, you can still stop the ovulation and still stop the pregnancy. And if the coitus takes place the day after, the reason the failure rate is as high as it is, 20%, is because if you happen to gather sperm on the day of ovulation, it's too late to stop ovulation, and therefore you will get pregnant. Questions about any of that? Here's an example of what it looks like. And I always, emphasize that because there are folks out there that are in fact opposed to contraception, but say that they're opposed to abortion. And therefore, you'll run into people who claim that PlanB is an abortifacient, that is, that it causes abortion. But you already know enough about the endocrinology of this, so there's no way that makes any sense, right? Gonadal steroids aid pregnancy. They only get in the way of ovulation. Good. Hold on. Go. You have to say it again. Yeah.
I think another reason of the chances of it not working being so high is because people just take one and it's based on weight. So I think if you're like 120 pounds, you can take one, but any more than that, you need multiple.
So you're saying dosage might matter, but also, of course, you have to use it properly. So you have to take first the one pill and then the other, right? 12 hours later is the other thing. Yeah. Question. Yeah. That PlanB should only be taken 2 to 3 times a year.
It might like disrupt like your hormones and stuff. That's something that I've heard. But then I saw recently that there's been a lot of ads for PlanB that say like, oh, take whenever, like take as many times as you need. So I'm kind of curious, like if you know about how like the limitations with it.
Yeah. So I mean, I suspect it's all nonsense. I mean, if in fact you think you might want to get pregnant next month, then maybe it would disrupt the next ovulatory cycle. But no, there's nothing we know about the endocrinology of this where, oh, I've boosted gonadal steroid levels for 2 days. Okay, that'll affect this ovulatory cycle, but all the steroids going to be gone within 48 hours. And so, yeah.
Yeah, and like the chemical compound of this is the exact same as most combination pills, so I don't see why it would cause any long-term issues if you take it more than one time.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, what she said. I mean, it's just, the pill. And since the pill doesn't interfere with that, right? I mean, in general, it's just, and I'll say this now and then I'll probably repeat this. Okay. I have total respect for people who think that every conceptus is special and holy and therefore should never be interfered with. I don't think you can't argue with people who believe that. You can't tell them they're wrong, and you have to respect that, I think. But what gets me is the same people who claim that are also opposed to contraception. Well, wait a minute. If you're opposed to abortions, the number one way to prevent them is contraception. So how is it you're both opposed to abortion and opposed to contraception? Because the real agenda is they don't want you to have sex. Or if you do, they want you to be punished for it. And these will be exactly the same people who, if a woman has a baby out of wedlock, for example, it'll be exactly the same people who will then condemn her for having done that. So that's why there's so much propaganda about PlanB. And this is what you have to be aware of and think about and ask for yourself. Is it wrong to have sex and not pay any consequences for that? I don't know. So bring back the answer when oh, this is important. I may or may not record a lecture for Tuesdays, but we are not meeting here on Tuesday. If I record a lecture, I'll put it on D2L beforehand, and so you can catch up there. Okay. Questions? Maybe real quick.
Question about like birth control and weight. This PlanB, like the brand PlanB, hasn't been tested on like high over 165 pounds, but there is a brand called Ella that has been. So if you're over 165 pounds, they recommend that for like it works better essentially.
I see. So one can get a larger dose meant for women who have a larger body weight. Okay, thank you.